Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, this is continuing the series that we were doing on akhlaq. And I think this is our third lecture on patience. We split it in the four pillars of akhlaq, and we said it was patience, justice, courage, and chastity. So we're still on patience. We've done the patience and what it means. We've done the patience on ta'ah, the patience on obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the patience in abstaining from haram things. Today we're going to be doing patience during the loss of a loved one. I know it's easier said than done, but there are a number of things that we, as Muslims, that we have to learn about the loss of a loved one, and how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually do that therapy and give us that therapy to be able to cope in enduring and being able to cope, to pass on and move on, and not go into the grief and be caged in our own grief. So inshallah today this is what we're going to be talking about. And of course, the first thought of how does Islam actually give that therapy, it actually starts with that the circle, with the two different pillars. That is, number one, it's a circle of life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in this world, and then it is a test. It is because it's a test for us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may prick us with certain hardships to test us. And the test itself, in other words, the hardship itself, is actually a sin remover, and therefore something that will elevate our levels. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when speaking about death, of course, the hardest hardship that anybody can go through is really the hardship of death, because there's nothing that you could do about it. Right there, the person in front of you is dying, is losing their soul, is right now, that even doctors are telling you that there's nothing that they could do about it. And it you come to that realization where subhanallah qahara ibadahu bil maut, that there's no one like unto the Lord Almighty, who had fully put us in submission at that moment of death. And it just comes to that point where there's nothing, not your wealth, not your power, not your knowledge, your intellect, whatever you want to think of in order to prevent death on you, there's absolutely nothing. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually reminds us of that and says, Kullu man alayha fan, wa yabqa wajhu rabbika dhul jalali wal ikram. At the end of the day, all shall taste the taste of death, and the only one that will remain is basically the face of the Lord Almighty, the one that is the most glory. So there's that one side of it, but then there's the other side, in where when we talk about the circle of life, that's why I use this ayah as the circle of life, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at the end, the circle of life is that kullu man alayha fan, everyone shall taste the taste of death. But then the other part with the test, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ, that lam right there and that noon right there is more of, there's a conviction, there is an emphasis that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will test us. In other words, Jannah is not going to be an easy task. There is a challenge. There are different contests that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will even put in front of us in our life, and test us in fear, test us in hunger, or even the reduction of wealth, or even the loss of loved ones, or even the loss of food. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. And it's a way of saying, for those that really want a higher level, for those that are seeking those that are seeking a bounty or seeking a bonus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, the bonus is really in the hardship that you will be facing in the different things in life. Now, I want you to look at this one right there, and where fear of different calamities in on our health, in our life, etc. And then it talks about even the fear, the struggling for survival, that is, that we might fear losing a job, or probably not getting or finding different means to continuing our life in, and probably facing things like hunger, and of course facing different evictions or different losses that you might not realize. And of course, on top of those is really the loss of a loved one, which is what we're actually talking about here. And إذا أصابتهم الذين إذا أصابتهم مصيبة. So here's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, bring that glad tidings for those that are at the level of patience, for those that want to be from the patient ones. Who are they? So that's why the ayah says, الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا. So the patients, the patient ones are really the ones that when they're pricked with a calamity, they would say, we belong to Allah Almighty, and to Him we shall return. And those are the ones that the Lord Almighty will fill with His forgiveness and mercy. And the Lord Almighty calls them وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُهْتَدُونَ. And those are the ones that are guided. Why are they called the ones that are guided? Well, they're called the ones that are guided because guidance actually takes in two levels. Guidance is in belief, in faith, in belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power rather than believing in your own power. And the second part with hidayah is really acting upon the principle rather than letting your emotions determine how you behave in different situations, whether the situation was pleasure or whether the situation was a calamity. So that's why he said, وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُهْتَدُونَ, in where even if it meant a calamity, a person that is guided has a principle that they want to live up to, and not let their emotions or their grief determine how they relate with that calamity that they're actually facing at the moment. Now, in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, in this hadith, you could see it's actually read by Muslim. This hadith is actually authentic. Of course, if it's narrated by Bukhari or Muslim, it's going to be authentic. So the hadith is basically on Salama. What is the hadith? Salama had lost her husband in the battle. Salama herself was grieving over one of the greatest men, and by the way, he is actually related to the Prophet ﷺ himself. And that was Abu Salama. Abu Salama gets killed. He becomes a shaheed. And Abu Salama was actually one of the earliest Sahaba that had migrated to Medina. And in fact, he had left behind because her family refused, that is Salama, because her family had refused that she would be accompanying her husband, she was actually left behind because her family would not allow her to migrate to Medina. So later she moves to Medina with her beloved husband, Abu Salama. But then the Prophet ﷺ, she hears that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, مَا مِنْ عَبْدٍ تُصِيبَهُ مُصِيبَةٌ فَيَقُولُ إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Every servant of the Lord Almighty who a calamity pricks them, and then they would say, we are for the Lord Almighty, we belong to Allah Almighty, and we shall return to Him. O Lord Almighty, أجرني في مصيبتي واخلف لي خيرا منها. Ajurni fi musibati actually means reward me for the patience that I'm enduring during this calamity, and bring me, in other words, get me and send me and make it destined for me that there would be a replacement for this calamity, that there would be something better, as there would be something good that would replace this calamity. And the Prophet ﷺ actually says that the Lord Almighty will replace that calamity. He'll give them the reward for being patient and will compensate them for what they had endured. And then she said, when I heard the Prophet ﷺ say that, I wondered, who's going to be better than Abu Salama, the Prophet ﷺ's companion? And later, she said, and then later, I actually married the Prophet ﷺ himself. So you could see that you might not actually expect where the good is coming from. Make the dua and let your Lord Almighty determine what good comes in compensation. Now, death is a fact of life, and a hardship is a fact of life. And this is really important, especially in parenting, with immediacy and trying to give our children whatever they want, and especially with social media. When you look at that immediacy, when you look at entertainment, when you look at many times parents would think that their responsibility is to give the children what they want, is not to deprive them the way that they might have lived in deprivation throughout their childhood, because, of course, wealth was scarce at the time, and more during our times. So the many parents, considering that their duty is to provide for their children, leaves a lot of children thinking that this is their right and that they actually have to get it without any effort, is leaving many children and even teenagers and even in their 20s, and right now it's going up in 30s and even 40s sometimes, in where they're taking for granted and don't want to put an effort because they think right now, of course, they're subconsciously, in their subconscious mind, they're right now thinking that this is something that they have to get by nature, that they have to get anyways, that it has to come to them, not realizing that there has to be an effort that is put in it. So when a calamity happens, whether the loss of a loved one or maybe a car crash or anything, or maybe grades going down, etc. That's why we're seeing, when we're looking at suicide or when we're looking at the rate of depression and rate of anxiety, that's why it's actually going up, and you could see it right there. Why is the rate going up? Even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within us the ability and the key to being able to move on in life, which is the coping capacity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it within us. But if we don't make that grow within us, how does it grow? You expand it, you grow it by letting it, not necessarily putting it in calamities, but helping helping yourself, and even helping the younger ones that you are a guardian over, learn how the different calamities are actually expanding your capacity in endurance and your capacity in coping with the different things that you may not get. And that's why when we look at death as a fact of life, and hardship as a fact of life, that's why, just looking at the different things in life, this poet actually said, المرء رهن مصائب ما تنقضي حتى يوسد جسمه في رمسه. So what does he say? He says all human beings are actually connected. In other words, they're held captives. They're held captives in the different calamities, that they will be facing, until the day that they will be folded with their corpse in their own grave. One will probably be seeing the death of those that are around him, and another one will see the death of himself. In the end, another poet actually says that there are 8 things every single one shall see, and every single one, they're going to get these 8 elements as facts of life. There's going to be the happiness, and there's going to be the pain and the calamity, and there's going to be the congregation, and there's going to be the moment when many are going to depart. And so you will see people around you and people leaving you. In other words, loneliness is a fact of life. Having people around you is not necessarily going to be something you'll always be seeing. And there are going to be the moments of hardship and the moments of ease, the moments of illness and the moments of remedy and cure. Now, when we look at patience and the loss of a loved one, how we relate to it is actually a manifestation of faith. So, what does it actually mean, a manifestation of faith? Yes, indeed, it is part of our own nature, where even I mentioned this before, that even Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ فَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. And where the Lord Almighty says that his eyes turned white from the sorrow, and fahuwa kadhim, it's more of a word to say fahuwa kadhim. You're describing a prophet that he was actually feeling the sorrow to the point that it didn't just affect his psychological situation. The psychological situation went so strong in him that it actually affected his organs. It affected his ability to see. But connecting with Allah Almighty actually helps that coping capacity grow within us, which is why don't misunderstand that Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, that the body reacting to the loss that he had faced, that he somehow lost his faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is actually absolutely wrong. This is a prophet and he's infallible. So that's why we could see that the ayah actually says, quoting Prophet Yaqub, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ وَاللَّهُ الْمُسْتَعَانُ عَلَى مَا تَصِفُونَ. When did he actually say that? He said, I will have beautiful patience. The beautiful patience is the patience where even though his body might actually feel the pain, just like any other illness, cancer, and you name the illness, there are certain things, regardless of how strong of a faith you are, the pain is still there. Enduring the pain and feeling the pain is actually part of our human nature. But how we cope with the pain is another side of our coping capacities. It's another side of how we relate with it. Can we grieve somehow? We cope, but still the grief is still affecting our organs or affecting our body. The answer is absolutely. You can feel the sorrow even though you're coping and you're moving on in your life. And that's why he said, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ. I will have that beautiful patience. وَاللَّهُ الْمُسْتَعَانُ. So clearly he said that he was seeking refuge. He was seeking the hope in and the power from Allah Almighty. وَاللَّهُ الْمُسْتَعَانُ. He seeks refuge عَلَى مَا تَصِفُونَ. Even though they were accusing him of somehow losing the coping capacity. Why? Because they had said, لولا أن تفندون. He was saying, I would tell you that I can smell the smell of Yusuf, but you're going to accuse me of losing my mind somehow, or you're going to think that somehow I went in this old age in where تفندون. It's like you're going to accuse me of losing my age because of age, that I'm losing my capacity to process the different things around me and that I'm starting to hallucinate somehow. So that's why he said, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ وَاللَّهُ الْمُسْتَعَانُ عَلَى مَا تَصِفُونَ. I know exactly what I am smelling that is. And it isn't until when they had thrown the garment of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, as Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam had actually ordered his brothers to do. And then that's when فَارْتَدَّ بَصِيرًا. That's when his sight came back. But I want you to just focus on that point in where the way our body reacts to the calamity and the grief around us. Can we go beyond 3 days, for example, if it's not a husband, still feeling the sorrow, still feeling the sadness, still feeling the sorrow and the sadness, but at the same time, I am trying to cope as much as I can in where I'm trying to get a job. I'm trying to, do the different things that I need to do. Is it possible that I'm still here grieving? We're going to talk about that in just a bit. But of course, like I said, patience on the loss of a loved one manifests faith, because you are then, it's kind of like a lens, it's kind of like a glasses that you're wearing to help you see the different things around you. How do you see the loss of a loved one? Are you seeing it as there is hope in it, as the unity is something that is possible, or are you seeing it as just a body decomposing and that's the end of life? So here, I love this poem right there. And he said, "Ya صاحب الهم إن الهم منفرج." I love what I loved about this poem is that the way he connected that everything is really in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, oh, you that is facing a calamity, remember, verily the calamity will soon end. Look up with hope, within good, because the one that uplifts and the one that opens the doors is actually the Lord Almighty, even though that was supposed to be al-ya'su. The word al-ya'su was supposed to be here. Al-ya'su يقطع أحيانا بصاحبه. Al-ya's is basically depression and anxiety. It can يقطع, it can separate, it can kill, it can destruct the one that is living in that calamity. But do not lose hope, because the Lord Almighty is suffice for you. الله يحدث بعد العسر ميسرة. The Lord Almighty has the power to create after every hardship ease. Do not despair, because the one that removes and uplifts every calamity is Allah Almighty. If you were tested, then have your confidence in the Lord Almighty and be content with it, because the one that uplifts and clears off the calamity is the Lord Almighty. By Allah, you do not have anyone but the Lord Almighty, and He is enough for you for every single hardship that you might face. How you perceive death and hardship is how you change the situation. Remember, Allah Almighty says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. That the Lord Almighty does not change the situation of anyone unless they actually change what is within themselves. In a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually says, you could see that this hadith is actually considered on the authentic side. He said, ما يزال البلاء بالمؤمن والمؤمن في نفسه وولده وماله حتى يلقى الله تعالى وما عليه خطيئة. What is the perception here? What is the lens that the Prophet ﷺ wants us to see in the calamities that we might be facing? He said, every calamity, the calamity that pricks a believer, a believing man, or even a believing woman in themselves, in other words, probably in their body, probably in their health, probably in their life, or even in their children, or even in their wealth, until they meet the Lord Almighty, and then all that was actually a sin remover. A sin remover, and the Lord Almighty had actually pricked him or her with the different calamities in order to wipe away the different sins, but on a condition that the person is actually patient and the person was connecting to the Lord Almighty. And I want you to look at that hadith. Let's go back to it really quick. And when we see how you perceive death and hardship, we actually look at it in this hadith. This is one lens in where we're seeing, not focusing on the calamity itself, but we're actually focusing on it from a lens that it is actually a sin remover. We look at it as a way to get us stronger and not weaker. And this is really important to consider, because when you look at calamity, if you see it as getting you weaker, it will get you weaker. But if you look at calamity as if it is strengthening your coping capacity, your coping strength, and your coping abilities, it will be so. What is the coping capacity that it will actually generate? The coping capacity that it will generate is really in the way that it connects you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember this. When you actually get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you actually get stronger. So in this situation, it's not only only in that moment when you stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on judgment day that everything is removed, but it's actually that connection that even in dunya it got you stronger because it got you closer to Allah Almighty. So the calamity itself is more of that generator to give you that closeness to the Lord Almighty, or it can be otherwise for somebody that's not a believer. It can be something that someone that's not a believer can actually feel that they want to disconnect from the Lord Almighty because they would think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually responsible for the calamity that they're facing. So moving on with the hadith, there are different losses that are quite different from one loss to the other. Well, in the situation of a loss of a husband, the Prophet ﷺ, I want you to look at this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, when Salama, and of course you're talking about a hadith that Salama actually narrated. We just mentioned it earlier, but I would like to quote it here. And I love this website. And think, what is it called? Forgot what it was called, but this website, yeah, there you go. It's called sunnah.com, sunnah.com. And they'll have the hadith for you with the translation and even on the reference. Although with the referencing, I wouldn't necessarily quote them all the time on it, because the reference, you cannot reference a hadith to actually say Riyadh al-Salihin. When you reference a hadith, you have to go back to the original reference, like here, Sahih Muslim. But regardless, they actually do a good job in at least referencing the hadith. It is worthy of noting that sometimes the translation is not very accurate, but it is still considered, at a good level. So remember this hadith when Salama, for the loss of her husband, how she was at that moment. She was at that moment transitioning her life, and she had a couple of orphan kids. She wasn't really trying to fathom. She wasn't capable of fathoming the loss of a great man, the loss of a kind man, the loss of a person that was really dear to her heart, and that there would be anybody to actually be at his level of righteousness, at his level of mercy, at his level of romance, you name, of what Salama was loving about her husband. And that's why she could not imagine that anybody would be at that level. But then, here's the thing, is that when I go to the aza and funerals and etc., many times you would see different types of people. The first type of people that you see, the majority, is that when you would talk to them, they would tell you, you don't know how I feel. And this is so common, in where many would tell you, you don't know how I feel, thinking that if you cannot feel what I am feeling, then therefore you cannot construct, you cannot instruct in any way, and you cannot help me reconstruct the situation that I am in, because you don't know how I feel. And this is a really dangerous thing to say, because the second that you think that I have to feel what you are feeling in order for me to bring about any type of an instruction, it's a really dangerous thing, because if that was the case, then we would not have any doctors or even anyone performing any type of a task to change any situation, because we would then accuse them, well, you would have to feel what I'm feeling in order for you to give me medication, or in order to change the situation that I am in. Well, when we want to change any situation, we don't necessarily have to use the emotions to change the situation. We don't have to live from your point of feelings and your point of emotions to correct a perspective. So even a therapist doesn't necessarily have to live all the emotions and all the different dynamics of the situation that might be surrounding this in order for them to instruct you on how to to move on and move forward. Well, that's the same thing in where Umm Salama, when she heard the Prophet ﷺ, she knew that that instruction was a divine instruction. And I must admit, I just want to seize the moment that I'm bringing this up. It is so sad that during our times, when a therapist would say, for example, an instruction or would give an instruction, everyone would say, well, the therapist said, as if her words were somehow divine words. Even though a lot of it is really based on theories, a lot of it is really based on different studies and different speculations. But when a sheikh or a sheikha gives a certain instruction, the word is always going to be in a condescending manner, in where as if they don't have the feelings, as if they don't have the right to instruct, because these people are somehow, laying out that information on us, and therefore they cannot instruct, even though the sheikh or the sheikha, if they would actually come, the instruction is the one that is not based on speculation, unless they were actually putting in their own perspective. So it's really sad to admit that, because it is really a reflection of how much the atheist method, the atheist method / postmodern methods, secular method, is always getting and infiltrating the masses to feel that a person from a religious standpoint is always going to be unheard, a place of sarcasm, a place of theory, a place of utopia, and therefore unrealistic in whatever presentation, whatever discourse they would be presenting. And here, definitely Salama did not view the words of the Prophet ﷺ as of anything of a utopian layout, and instead she took it seriously because she knew that this was a divine instruction, a divine promise from the Lord Almighty. And that's why she said, when I heard the Prophet ﷺ say that if a person would make the dua, we are for the Lord Almighty, to him we shall return. O Allah Almighty, reward me for the patience, the endurance that I'm trying to hold in, and replace me, instead of this hardship, something better, that the Lord Almighty will actually reward them and replace them for for the calamity that they are going through. She did it, and she said it. She didn't stand up and say, well, you don't know what I'm talking about. You don't know how I feel about this. You don't know, etc. Even though there was a lady, by the way, where the Prophet ﷺ was passing by a graveyard, a cemetery that is, and a lady was grieving over the loss of her husband, over her husband's grave, that is. She was crying, and then the Prophet ﷺ was instructing her, and she said, well, you don't know how I feel about this. Until she was actually told that that was actually the Prophet ﷺ himself. And that's when she understood that the instruction was actually a divine instruction. It's not of any speculation. And that it doesn't have to be, the instruction does not have to be coming from a person that is actually grieving in the same way that you're grieving. It doesn't have to be coming from an emotional standpoint, but it is enough that the instruction or the support is coming from the instruction that is based on Islam. So when you look at this, the loss of a husband, of course, there is the grief where the Prophet ﷺ, actually in the ayah, in the Quran, and even in the Sunnah, that the loss of a husband, the woman, unlike any other loss, the woman that is the wife, is actually instructed to do the mourning for 4 months and 10 days. Do we know why exactly those numbers of days and months? We don't actually know why those exact numbers of days and months. It's an instruction from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so it becomes tawqifi, it becomes something that we just say, sami'na wa ata'na, we hear and we obey the Lord Almighty. So the loss of a husband, unlike any other loss, Islam does actually instruct that the woman has the right, and I would like to say the word has the right, because grief sometimes can can uh, can sometimes, capture us. It can put us in this cage. It's not only that she has the right, she's actually instructed and obligated not to necessarily grieve per se, but to do the mourning, in where she does not marry someone else, does not get engaged with for the time of her mourning for 4 months and 10 days. But does that mean she has to wear black? She doesn't have to wear black, but she is instructed to abstain from different beautification things, or things that normally a woman would do for her husband. She doesn't have to close the windows and close the doors and all that. If she needs to leave her home for necessity, probably go to the clinic, or probably grocery shop, or probably the items necessary for the household, she can actually go. Even if she had a job, she needed to get, her rent paid or whatever it is. Even if she has a job, she can actually continue doing her job, but then she would have to be back but by nighttime, or in other words, during sunset. So the question is, what is the invocation that I should do during calamities? The invocation, the most important invocation, is right there. So I put that, I put that in order for you all to see right there. So inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Allahumma adurni fi musibati wa khluf li khayran minha. Put the words right here in English, and you could see that this is actually in, they said Hisn al-Muslim. It's actually in Sahih Muslim. Hisn al-Muslim is, it's actually the wrong reference to actually reference in that way. I mentioned that before. Now, the other type of loss is the loss of child. This is actually a very hard one to talk about, because the loss of a child, it's oh my God, ya Allah. I don't know why the loss of a child just grabs me, and it, at that moment, especially when I remember one of my students. She's only 5 years old. She was only 5 years old, and she died of cancer. And subhanallah, that young girl, we made lots of dua. She was a Pakistani girl, and in those moments, in remembering the struggle, both of her parents are actually doctors, and both of her parents were trying to do the best in order to help their daughter get the cure and the remedy, etc. But subhanallah, the way that she even got ill, the father actually speaks, and I couldn't hold my tears listening to his words. The father actually speaks that, a very vibrant girl, and always jumping up and down, and even though he's a doctor, but didn't realize that there was something that was really an indication to a major illness. But it wasn't until she was playing in the masjid, just really walking in the masjid, then another doctor friend realizes that there's actually something like a wound on her ankle. But the doctor friend, pediatrician, looks at it and feels it right away, and right away instructs the doctor mother, even though she's a doctor, a dentist as well, and the father is actually not a dentist, but specialized, I believe, in respiratory system and stuff, and says that she's actually realizing, and a very dangerous illness right there, and it turned out to be bone cancer. But it was too late. And subhanallah, إذا وقع القدر أعمى البصر. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destines something, He will blind you from seeing it. The father was there, the mother was there. They were both doctors. It's like having, if two doctors are at home, it's kind of like having, a semi-hospital right in front of you, right around you. But then they were blinded, and it wasn't until the level of cancer had already reached stage 4, and stage 4, you're actually speaking about probably no chance of even getting to a cure. They still decide to do whatever they can in hope of probably getting the cure. And I remember I was told that the daughter wasn't going to have much time to live. So I called the mother. I remember that it was a Thursday, I believe, and I called the mother at night and I say, hey, can I come over to actually visit and see her? She said she only has 2 weeks to live. And the father was very strong to actually himself, be with the team of clinicians that were helping the girl. And he himself just looks at where the cancer had spread in her body. And as a clinician, in the respiratory illness, he looks at it and he knows that by looking at that X-ray, that it had spread even in her lungs, and that no, she's not going to live much. So he takes that X-ray down and goes to his wife and tells his wife, let's go, we're leaving. I'm going to take our daughter home. She only has 2 weeks to live. To actually hear him speak of his own daughter, to speak in such strength, is always teaching me a lesson. Because, subhanallah, it's you can have all those PhDs in Islamic studies, you can be a Hafidh al-Quran, you can be whatever degree you can have, or whatever number of days you were doing salah. This is that manifestation of true faith, is that when you face a calamity and the death of a loss, the death of a loved one, and you stand and you're able to hold strong, that is the true Iman. So this father, he was aware that his daughter was dying. Mother was standing next to her bed, and the girl was telling them that, they're telling me that they're going to take me to a better place. And she's talking to different things. And Charlie was actually the malaika. And the mother was really unaware that, there's malaika surrounding her, etc. And they can actually see the malaika when a person is dying. They could actually see the malaika. Took a few bites, and I remember, I believe 6 a.m., I get the phone call from the mom, and she says, Aysha, come over. I want you to come right now. I thought she was actually still dying. She said, no, she just passed away a couple minutes ago, and didn't know what to do. I drive, and that was my first time going into their beautiful home, big home, right on a beautiful lake. And the girl was just, of course, bald and on this bed, and you can smell the beautiful misk right there. The power that family had actually faced was beyond what I had ever seen. I must admit, I thought that was their first daughter. It turned out to be their fourth daughter that they had buried. But to see, those examples during our time, the mom did not actually shed a tear. The father, although very strong, he comes in holding himself, but was able to make it to the room to actually see his daughter in her room. And then he says, am I allowed to cry? I said, you're allowed to cry, just don't scream. He cried, and of course, he said, I've seen many die because I'm a doctor, but this is very different. This is his fourth child. And subhanAllah, just to see that and see their ability to cope with that and to be so strong and even smell the misk was very different. Later, I actually hold halaqas in their house, teenagers classes and different things. But while I was in that halaqa, I was hearing mourning sounds. I was hearing somebody moaning. and somebody crying. And I ask Maryam, who's actually the mother, I say, Maryam, what's going on? I'm hearing somebody crying, somebody moaning. What is that? And she said, it's still my husband. He couldn't, after 6 months, forget his own daughter. Of course, it's his own daughter. What do you expect? So he comes and he says, ask her if I'm allowed to talk to her because, I don't want to do ikhtilat. So he says, I just have a question and just a comment to say. And I'll quote what he said. And he was really giving me the lesson. He said, you see this beautiful home that I have right now? You see everything that's around me? I can't see it anymore. I only see Allah. The death of my child is one of the biggest blessings that I had been given. It's not the beautiful home that you see. It's not the lake, and it's not the money, and it's not any of those materialistic blessings that you see. It's actually the iman that the death of my child had brought me. It's because I was able to see farther than the materialistic dunya, to actually see the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His power and the hope and the coping capacities that He had given me. And subhanAllah, I'll never forget that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala join them with their daughter. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability and the strength to be able to cope when we actually fall in such things. I always say, one of the most lectures that I hate giving is patience. Because it's not a lecture to give. At all. It's not a lecture to give. It's a thorn to swallow. Whether you swallow it or whether you spit it out, it will still prick you. It will still be painful. It's not easy. And there are many out there that will be stronger than us, that we might think that, we usually think that, hey, she's giving us the halaqah. For sure she's stronger. But when you give the halaqah, when you speak, it's not the words that you necessarily say, but it's actually the lessons that you hear. And it could be you telling it to me. It could be you telling it to me. We remind one another. I know all this, we all know. All that I'm saying, we all know. But that's why, فَذَكِّرْ إِنَّ الذِّكْرَى تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Just remind, because even though they're mu'mineen, even though they're believers, but it will be beneficial to them. When we look at the death of a child, the Prophet ﷺ actually said in the hadith, إِذَا مَاتَ, this hadith was, sorry about that. Sorry for you guys, getting, what is the word? Oh no, I lost where the Prophet ﷺ actually said in a hadith, where a man comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he had a son with him, and the Prophet ﷺ says, do you love him? And he says, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love you as much as I loved him. The Prophet ﷺ later misses the man. In other words, he doesn't see him in sight. And he asks, what happened to that man? And the Prophet ﷺ was told his own son died. In other words, that young boy actually died. The Prophet ﷺ then tells the father, would you not want to come to an entrance, a door in Jannah, but find your son standing at that door waiting for you? So the man says, is it just for him, or is it for all of us? In other words, waiting for both of us, that is. And he said, but is actually for both of you or for all of us? Every single one that loses a son or a daughter, that they'll actually have their child waiting for them at every single door in Jannah. waiting for them, and they would not want to enter Jannah, but with them holding their hands of their holding their parents' hands to enter with them in Jannah. So, what is the reward of being patient on a loved one? The first one is really the protection from hellfire. And you could see that in the hadith where a woman came to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, and of course the son is actually ill or something. So she's saying, well, he's complaining of an illness. Of course, she said, and I fear for him. And I had already buried 3. So the Prophet ﷺ tells her, you have لقد احتضرت بحضار شديد من النار. So you have here protected yourself with a massive protection from hellfire. And you could see that the Prophet ﷺ telling her that you had now built yourself a massive protection from hellfire because of the loss of her loved ones, because of the loss of her children. And just that endurance, just that strength to be able to endure that amount of pain is really how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give one the protection from hellfire, and then grant her or that parent, grant them, or even if it was your own mother or father, grant them Jannah. And which is why in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, ما لعبد المؤمن عندي جزاء إذا قبضت صفيه من أهل الدنيا ثم احتسبه إلا الجنة. That for every ما لعبد المؤمن, لعبدي is like saying for the believing servant, for every believing servant, there is no reward if I had taken his chosen, that is the loved one, from the people of dunya, and then they would seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, they would grieve for the Lord Almighty. There is no reward but Jannah, that the Lord Almighty will give him only Jannah. There is no better reward for that. In the other part, in where, so I'm grieving, but what can I do for the death of my loved one? Number 1, dua. So the Prophet ﷺ actually said in the hadith, ما من عبد مسلم يدعو لأخيه بظهر الغيب إلا قال الملك ولك بمثل. So this hadith is narrated by Muslim, that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, for every single Muslim that would invoke Allah Almighty for his Muslim brother without him being present, but an angel would be there to tell him, and for you there is the same. Now this is more comprehensive in when a Muslim is making the dua for a Muslim brethren. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're necessarily alive. It can be for a dead brethren as well. The other thing that you can do is the donation on their behalf. And that's why the Imam al-Nawawi, one of my favorite scholars, and by the way, Imam al-Nawawi has a lot of, there's a lot to really read about Imam al-Nawawi, because this scholar was so much in Iman that there is a barakah, there is a blessing. He is the only scholar in that his book, even though he's not the only one that compiled books of hadith, but his book is the only book to be printed in those numbers, which is Riyadh al-Salihin, and close to the numbers of Quran. It is in every single masjid. It is in every single home almost. Riyadh al-Salihin. It's a compilation of the books of the most important hadiths, and every home should have Riyadh al-Salihin. And Nawawi says, because donation actually reaches the dead one, and he will benefit from them with no disagreements between Muslims, with no disagreements between scholars. And this, he actually mentioned it in his explanation, exegesis on Sahih Muslim, because of the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, إِذَا مَاتَ الْإِنسَانُ قَطَعَ عَنْهُ عَمَلُهُ إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثَةٍ. That if the human dies, everything, in other words, his deed, deeds are basically closed up. In other words, there's no addition to the deeds except in three matters. One, a donation that is continuous. Two, a knowledge that others are benefiting from. And three, a pious child that is making dua for him. So from that, if you actually donate on their behalf, or you even invest in the things the deceased left behind. So let's say they had written a book or some knowledge, or even if it were talking about maybe, share the khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward us for what we're doing, but you share a video that is probably, speaking of salah, speaking of hadith, speaking of tafsir, speaking of such, then you're sharing. And when that video is shared, this khair, this hasana will actually come back even if the person was actually deceased. So whether it's a knowledge, a wealth, or even children, so you invest in raising their children, whether probably pay for their tuition or probably invest in raising them in a pious way, then that will actually come back to their ajr. You will get the reward, and even the deceased one will also get the reward for having that child make the dua for them in the future. Note, things like flowers, tombs, and stone tombs, and all those things, they don't really benefit from the dead. I know it feels, somehow comforting to go and put flowers on a graveyard, but it does not benefit the dead whatsoever. It benefits you, maybe it makes you feel, good about it, but it's kind of like putting a cake over a graveyard. They're not going to wake up and actually snatch anything from it. The other thing is mention the good things that they had done to motivate others to make dua for mercy. So even when you remember, my father used to do this, just remember the khair that they used to do. The khair is, it's motivating you to say rahimahullah, Allah yarhamu, and it's also motivating you to remember to invest good, because it will come back as something that will be in your remembrance. Of course, a famous hadith to mention here is the hadith that لا تسبوا الأموات فإنهم قد أفضوا إلى ما قدموا. Do not the word tasubbu is sub is really speaking ill of the dead. So the Prophet is saying don't speak ill of the dead, because they had faced all the different things that they had done, that is. All right. Now the other hadith, اذكروا محاسن موتاكم وكفوا عن مساويهم, only mention the good things and stay away from mentioning the bad things, is actually not an authentic hadith. It's not an authentic hadith. So just wanted to mention that one. But there is a hadith you could see right there. It's actually in Sahih al-Bukhari. So this hadith, do not speak ill of the dead. This hadith is actually authentic. I love the fact that this is a right referencing, but the ones before are not. What does it mean to not be patient? If we're talking about patience, we understand that one. So what does it mean to not be patient? Number one is il-jaza, to act in il-jaza. What is il-jaza? So il-jaza is to let your emotions determine your behavior. So what does that mean? Let's say your moment of grief, you're screaming, you're yelling, you're ripping your clothes, you're knocking off things or people around you, you're losing hope, you're giving up on life, probably not working, isolating yourself, not engaging in life matters, marriage, or not engaging in education, children, you quit school, etc. Those are all different ways of grief that is actually against Islam. But here's the thing, somebody might say, but this person is grieving, but it's not actually in their hands. In other words, it becomes more like a post-traumatic syndrome. It's more of a PTSD. So if the person needed some medication to help them cope with different things, it's not haram to take those medications if medications were given by the doctors to help them I guess, retrieve their ability to cope, etc. Because depression and the loss, it does differ from one person to another. So to take medications for situations where the person is dealing with PTSD and they're not getting their structure and their psychology or their feelings or their grief is going beyond control, then it's not doesn't necessarily have to be that the person is just bad in their deen. It can also be an illness that may require medication, and it's not haram to take the medication, and it's not a sign of a person's lack of faith. So Islam's method of therapy in patients, number one, when we're talking about not over grieving. So, what does that mean? It's basically training you to hold your feelings rather than let your grief determine your behavior. So, hold yourself from overreacting. And that's why Islam actually orders you to do that therapy, in where it orders you to seek different things in life, maybe get a job, maybe seek education, maybe get married. And of course, that's why it instructed that it's actually haram to mourn for more than 3 days but on a husband. Replacing your vision, and this is really important, replacing your vision. So Islam is telling you, well, you got to replace your vision, but that's not enough. You could, you could instruct anybody, hey, I want you to, I want you to look at it from a different angle. Well, how do I do that? And which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually, replaced it in the different hadith, like we said, in that ajurni fi musibati, you're here training yourself on how to look. Well, there is hope coming in. There is a replacement. Just look up to it. You're going to find it. You just have to focus on how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant it for you. You just have to focus on that optimistic, and focus on optimism rather than be pessimistic. And look, even if you are not seeing anything in dunya, you will be granted Jannah. So you're looking at it from a different angle. And of course, making dua. This is really important, because to replace your vision, it's easier said than done, which is why part of replacing the vision, it's kind of like this therapy in where repetition, you're speaking to yourself, but you're actually talking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in making dua, you're actually repeating it to yourself. You're instructing yourself. You're doing that maw'idha, that good word for yourself. You're making that instruction for yourself, even though you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is hearing your words, to create hope and change the situation. Repetition is important to recharge your energy in seeing hope rather than the loss, in seeing optimism rather than pessimism, in seeing hope and life rather than only grief and the loss, and enhance the hope in you. So that repetition is extremely important to help you as a method of therapy. The other part is connecting with the loved one through virtue of donation. So what are you doing? Yes, it's okay to connect with them, connect with the good things, with maybe the virtue that they had done. My father, he educated me, and I want to always remember that he was the person that paid for my tuition. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have been at the level that I'm in, etc. Or even the piety. I want to, for example, thank my mother and make dua for her. Alhamdulillah, both my mother and father are alive. Just to mention the piety. Mention the piety, and that's a way of connecting with the virtue that they had left behind. Because whoever leaves a good virtue, a good deed, a good action, a good behavior, and or even does it, and others are imitating them, or trying to copy what they're doing, they will get the reward for it as well. So let's say Sister Aida, for example, is doing a good a good deed, and no one did anything like it before, and she came up with an idea of, I don't know, putting Quran books in different corners or whatever it is, or probably going to every single hospital and donating Quran or little Islamic pamphlets every once in a while, etc. What is she doing? She started something new and it became an organization, and this organization started making more da'wah, trying to reach out to those people, etc. Then you're creating a new method, you're creating a deed, you're creating an idea to make that virtuous act, and people are replicating what you're doing, so then you're getting the deed for it. Patience for facing hardships, inshallah, we will continue that next week. Sorry if I went beyond my time, so I would be happy to hear if anybody would like to unmute themselves or even write in the chat. I'd be happy to hear what questions they have, or comment even. So go ahead if you would like to. I guess I don't know how this works. So Sister Huma, if you could help me, are they able to unmute themselves? I have no idea. Now this is a calamity right there. They're not allowed to unmute themselves. No, they're not. Okay, Mishal is telling me she's okay. So if you are, how do you do this? Then there's no option, really? Okay, hold on. I will give you the option. Allow to talk. I just did it. You should be allowed to talk. Okay. Ask to unmute. So if you want to ask something, there we go. Mishal, just put it in the chat.
I just wanted to let you know that we couldn't. I didn't actually have anything to contribute. Sorry.
All right, Mishal, it was a pleasure hearing your voice, and especially amid, with what's happening in South Africa with the new, with that new mutation. I don't know what they're called. What is it called? Amicorn.
Omicron?
Amicorn. There you go. They're, I don't know. The name just sounds Amicorn. It sounds something legend. I don't know. Maybe unicorn. I'm connecting it with that maybe, but it sounds very legend like. But yeah, alhamdulillah. If anybody would like to say anything, you can actually write it in the chat, and I believe I can unmute you. So if you would like to say anything, maybe correct me if I might have worded something wrong or translated something wrong, or you would like to probably share a story of how you learned from probably the grief, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compensated you for a grief that you were patient in. We'd like to hear it too. So let's see, Firiel Musani, seriously, wow. All right, so Firiel, we'd like to hear you. Go ahead. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I think one thing that actually was a gem for me is when you were talking about Yaqub alayhi salam, and how his grief was manifested as a physical illness. Because as a therapist within our communities, right, like within our immigrant population, our older adults, well, when they're going through something that's physical, that all the tests are coming back okay, from the doctors and everything, but the fatigue, the aches are still in their bodies. It sort of gives me that extra knowledge to be able to tell them and connect it to, like, Yaqub alayhi salam. Now, I can't be 100% sure, but in the therapy room especially as well, when illnesses come where there's a lot of physical manifestations, there is something psychological, like either grief or depression or pain. So that was a very helpful gem for me. So jazakallahu khairan.
وإياكم ربي يحفظك Sister Feriel, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you lots of blessings, and make dua, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give Sister Feriel 10 kids, Ya Rab. Say Ameen, everyone.
Ameen.
Say Ameen. You know what, Sister Feriel, I want to tell you a story. So I was one time in a masjid. This is, off topic. But I was, I used to study in Dar al-Hadith. All right? Dar al-Hadith in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. One of the girls that used to study with me, I just know, she was 19, got married, and moved on. 5 years have passed, and I was in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And I saw the girl that was studying with me 5 years ago, and Yasmin was holding a little boy. She was playing with the little boy, and a lady comes in, and she just says, "Give me the boy, I want to change his diaper." Yasmin just gives her the boy and starts crying. The lady was really saying it in a rude and cruel way, by the way, the second lady. I saw her tears, and she went crying, and I said, "Yasmin, who was that?" And she said, that's my co-wife. And I said, and who was the baby? And she said, that's actually my husband's son. And I said, and why are you crying? She said, nothing, nothing, nothing. I said, Yasmin, did you get any kids? And she said, no. I said, why did your husband marry a second wife so fast? And she said, because my mother-in-law insisted that my husband, he hasn't gotten any kids from me for 5 years. It's about time that he gets married to a second wife to make sure that that he gets offsprings and that he gets children. She continued to cry. I said, Yasmin, get yourself over here. That's not how we grieve, and that's not how we do things. And I used to give durus in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And she said, it's okay, it's okay. I'll be okay. I said, no. That's not how we do things. I said, come on over, Yasmin. And we're going to go to, there's an area in al-Masjid al-Aqsa for those that want to go to al-Masjid al-Aqsa. It's called Bab al-Jannah. It's really where women actually pray. It has nothing to do with Jannah, but, that's what it was named. It was named Bab al-Jannah. And the elderly women and the women that I give durus to are sitting there. And I was like, okay, ladies, hajjat, gather. We've got something to do right here. And the ladies in the hajjat, they gather. And they're like, what? You're going to give us a halaqah right now? It was like a different thing. We're on a mission here. They're like, so what are we going to do? I said, listen, I'm going to do the dua and you guys are going to say Ameen. Agree? And those hajjat, some of them are wallahi. Rahim Allahu man mata minhun. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shed his mercy on whoever had died from them. And many of them young women. We were almost 50 or so. So we gather, and I was saying, Ya Allah, Ya Hayyu Ya Qayyum, grant Yasmin children that you will be blessing them and they will be from the Salihin. And they were like, Ameen, Ameen. And all of us were Ameen. Wallahi, our voices filled al-Masjid al-Aqsa, Qubbat al-Sakhra, our voices filled with Qubbat al-Sakhra, with us, Ameen, Ameen. And I'm making the dua. Wallahi al-Azim. 7 months passed, and I was walking in Bab al-Amud. I was walking in Damascus Gate near the bus station. And I was on the bus. I was actually on the bus, and I see Yasmin walking past by the bus with her stomach huge and big. And I was like, Yasmin, what happened? I couldn't but get my head outside the window and yell it out, Yasmin, what happened? And she pointed at her stomach and said, Allah answered the dua. Allah answered the dua. Wallahi al-Azim. Subhanallah. Wallahi al-Azim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers the dua. It was, that moment that I'll never forget. Allah answered the dua, and she said it with all the tears filling her. It's like, it was the dua. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers the dua. I'll never forget that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give Fariya al-Musani 10 kids, Ya Rabbi. Ameen, Ameen. And make them from the Salihin. And Allahu Akbar. I'm Palestinian, so we don't go for less than 10. 10 is our number, and then below that number, it just means that they're living a Western lifestyle. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. These people are infiltrated by the Western kind of lifestyle, so it's different. All right. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give the sa'ada and the happiness for the sisters that are with us and even listening to us. If she needs children, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them children. If she needs health, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them health. If she needs a husband, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them pious husbands. And if she needs happiness in her marriage, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant her happiness in her marriage. And if they need rizq, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them rizq. And jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.